As Pamela B. Zohar writes, orthodoxy, the term, the movement, the set of ideas, arose in response to reform. Outside of that, it's not a designation with much specific meaning. There were certainly more liberal and more conservative interpretations of Jewish law and teaching. A Haaretz article, for example, recently detailed ancient Jewish art showing the figure. This indicates that visual representation of human form was not seen as a violation of the commandment against idolatry, at least in some parts of ancient Israel. Jewish tradition is certainly influenced by Greek words and ideas, and in Hellenic Greece, there were different ideas about how much we could accept and receive from Greek culture, versus focusing more intensively on our own civilization, language, and tradition. Then as now, people had different feelings and sensibilities about assimilation, about the wider world and the rise of new ideas. For example, the Hebrew word for heretic, apikoros, is actually taken from the term Epicurean, the hedonistic philosophy in ancient Greece, although there, naturally, it has a negative meaning. The disputes between the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai are famous in all forms of Judaism, and a bedrock part and principle of the body of law and teaching known as the Talmud. Ultimately, most disputes were decided in favor of the school of Hillel. It is recorded in large part because of his moderation, sensibility, and commitment to studying the views of those with whom he disagreed. Before the rise of Jewish emancipation, an extremely partial, incomplete process that began in France, Jews were mostly isolated from broader society. This was the case pretty much everywhere, excepting China and India. Otherwise, in Europe, Arab Islamic lands, and Ethiopia, Jews lived in isolation in large part. They weren't opposed to or accepting of modernity because modernity wasn't really a trend yet. There is a range of ideas in the tradition itself about all kinds of subjects. Also, Judaism is not only a religion but also, and in some ways most essentially, about peoplehood, civilization, community and culture. Jews were busy preserving our own food and language and literary and religious cultures and so much more. Maimonides' 13 Principles of the Faith is a core set of ideas that runs through many interpretations of the Jewish tradition. But it's not a solely orthodox part of Jewish liturgy, spirituality or heritage. Plenty of Jews rely on it as a sort of Jewish statement of principles. That said, Jewish faith and culture and heritage is defined more by deeds than beliefs, at least comparative to other religions. Actually, no. All Jews were just Jewish. Some were more traditional than others. Some were barely observant at all. Then the Reform movement started, and after that, the more traditional Jews began defining themselves as orthodox, and not only maintained a traditional lifestyle and behavior, but also made certain changes, specifically rejecting certain Reform positions. So, oddly enough, orthodoxy as a movement is actually younger than the Reform movement, and as a response to the Reform movement. Conservative Judaism is a counter-response to the Reform movement, turning back toward a more traditional movement, but not all the way back, in a manner of speaking. So neither Orthodox nor Reform, and conservative Judaism is related to a Central European philosophy known, I believe, as traditional historical. It sounds better in German. All these, Orthodoxy, Reform and conservative Judaism, had their roots in Central Europe, mainly in Germany, and are really only a thing among Ashkenazi and related Jewish communities. Sephardic Jews and Mizrachi Jews never had a Reform movement, and therefore never had a counter-Reform movement called Orthodoxy. Sephardic and Mizrachi Jews are still just Jews, and although usually included broadly in the Orthodox umbrella category, they are, actually, merely normally traditional Jews. Not exactly. Beginning in the 7th century AD, there has always been a small sect that challenged orthodoxy, the Karet. The Karaite sect first arose in Iraq, then spread mostly to Egypt, Turkey, Crimea. There was even a small presence in Galicia and Lithuania. They believe only in the written Torah, not the oral Torah. So both ideologically and practically, they differed from orthodoxy. But to give the big picture, prior to Reform Judaism, the vast majority of Jews, 95%, were Orthodox. Since the spread of Reform Judaism in America in the 19th century, less and less Jews were Orthodox. But then came a completely different factor that contributed terribly: the anti-Judaism of the Soviet Union. This pushed 3 million Jews out of Orthodox Judaism. Both Reform Judaism in the West and Soviet atheism in the East have produced a situation where Orthodox Jews are now just a small minority.